to. On Sunday, a tripwire bomb hit a completely different part of town and injured 2 people who are white. Were they targets? Does that mean race played no role, or a role that's more confusing than we imagined? Motives in these cases tend to be impossible to guess without evidence, though that doesn't stop people from trying. Remember, the Unabomber was waging a one-man war against the Industrial Revolution. That's not something FBI profilers would have surmised, or did. And what do the bombs themselves tell us? Is there a pattern to their design? Do they bear any resemblance to explosives used by terror groups abroad, to IEDs used in the Middle East? And last and most important, how close are police to catching whoever is doing this? FedEx turned over an unexploded bomb to police, and police believe they know where the bombs were sent from. Will that lead anywhere? We don't know. All of these questions need to be answered in order to understand the attacks, their cause, and whether there are broader implications for the rest of us. But for now, it seems wiser to focus on answers rather than reaching conclusions unsupported by evidence. Buck Sexton is a former CIA counterterrorism analyst, and he joins us tonight. Buck, does anything about what we know so far arrange itself into a pattern for you?
No, Tucker. The forensic analysis is going to be absolutely critical, and that's why having an unexploded bomb would be particularly useful here, because anytime you're dealing with a bomb that's actually detonated, you could lose some of the most important information you would get. People often think of fingerprints. That's usually not what you're going to find. People will use gloves when they're building a bomb. But DNA is much harder to prevent from getting on one of these devices. Some of that would be burned off once a device goes, but sometimes it won't be. And if they have an intact device, now you may get your first real break in this case.
So you were trained in explosives during your career. You often hear that a bomb has been detonated in some contained space. Is the bomb photographed or measured or in other ways examined before it is?
I'm sorry. So yes, Tucker, absolutely. Well, it depends. If they're worried about the bomb being a threat to public safety, they'll command detonate it first to make sure that there's obviously no loss of life or injuries, and then in a contained space afterwards, they can piece by piece put it together and look at everything. So in a case like, for example, where the tripwire was the activating device, that you're going to have fragments, you're going to have shrapnel that go quite a ways, and so the forensic analysis of that is going to take a longer time. But when they're actually command detonating it, deciding to set it off before it can do any harm, then it would be in an enclosed space and area. It's going to be a faster procedure to go through whatever they have. But you don't want anyone, obviously, to get hurt. That's first and foremost the main consideration.
So are we sure these bombs are connected to each other? So if, by my understanding, the first 2 were placed. The third was a tripwire, which just obviously was placed as well. And then the bombs that FedEx is reporting were, of course, sent. So would that be the same? Does that suggest it's the same person?
What it suggests is that the person, assuming it's one person, as you mentioned, it may be a group, is varying tactics, techniques, and procedures here to make it harder to track them down and also to increase the fear here. I mean, this is about a campaign of terror of one kind or another. It might be a madman who has a personal grudge against the state, against the government, who knows. Could also be somebody who has a more specific political manifesto. By changing things up, Tucker, it makes it harder for law enforcement to track a pattern. And so that seems to be part of the additional planning here, which, by the way, just the increase in the sophistication of the devices makes it seem like it's likely we're dealing with somebody who has really planned this out, who may have prior experience with explosives, and is going to continue this for the foreseeable future until he's caught.
And is taking real risks if he's placing these, it seems to me. Buck Sexton, thank you for that perspective. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tucker.
Mark Steyn is an author and columnist and a keen and wise observer of America as it changes. He joins us tonight. Mark, what do you make of this?
Well, it's interesting to me, Tucker, because as Buck was saying, there's 3 different methods this guy's used, if it's the same guy. The FedEx aspect of it is interesting to me because one always gets the impression with FedEx, the barcodes, the information you have to supply, that they know every aspect of that package from the moment you enter the facility with it, as it proceeds to where it's going and as it's delivered to whoever the recipient is. So it's interesting to me that that is not in fact the case, that apparently they have no way of just looking up their barcodes, looking at the times, and actually identifying who put this thing in the system. That's actually quite revealing in an age when, if you write a handwritten birthday card to your granny and take it to the post office, the United States Postal Service, which isn't actually a cutting-edge business, actually films that and keeps a photographic record of your handwritten birthday card to granny. So there are odd aspects about this. In the panopticon state, in the all-seeing surveillance state, somebody is identifying some actually quite useful holes.
Well, I mean, the whole point of the surveillance state is to prevent things like this in the first place, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's true, but I think what's actually happening is that it's becoming a bit like overlapping area codes. You know, when the old area code gets filled up and they introduce a new area code over the same geographical area. I think we are moving to a world where we actually have two groups of people inhabiting the same real estate. You have people who are monitored incessantly, so that as we saw at Speaker's Corner in London, people can fly in, an American lady with no criminal record can fly in to the other side of the world, land at Luton Airport in London, and Her Majesty's government will deport her because of something she said on social media. Everything is known about her. At the same time, you have people like the Las Vegas bomber who lived a life that left no footprint, so that 6 months after that attack, we actually know as little about him and his motivations as we did on the night it happened. And these two groups of people, you know, a good name for the second group of people, if it hadn't been taken by illegal immigrants, would be undocumented. Every aspect of law-abiding people's lives is documented up the wazoo, and yet you have this other group of people who manage to find all the shadows and the pockets and move about unseen and unknown. And there's going to be a lot more of that in the future.
Well, it's setting up perverse incentives against participating in legitimate ways in society, it seems to me.
That's absolutely right. I think you're going to have people who, and by the way, just to throw in the third example, the Parkland guy, there was a guy who had a big social media presence, but it's almost as if the more we leave clues on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, the more, as in the case of Nicholas Cruz, nobody actually pays any attention to what he's doing in front of your nose, so that we monitor people's social media behavior actually more than we monitor what they're doing when we're in the same room as them.
That's exactly right. And of course, there are thousands of potentially dangerous, crazy people living on our streets, and we just ignore them completely. Mark, thank you. Great to see you tonight.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
Republicans control both houses of Congress, and they're about to pass a huge spending bill. What does that bill reflect? Could it be it reflects Democratic priorities rather than this week, unless Congress can pass a spending bill? Republicans in Congress seem like they're about to do that. They say they are. So what's in the deal? Well, probably not a lot of what you voted for in 2016. The final bill is expected to spend $1.3 trillion. That'll, of course, dramatically increase the deficit. What it won't do is provide a single dollar for the border wall, even though the president got elected, as you may remember, on a pledge to build one. The law will not pull funding from sanctuary cities, even though those cities are deliberately acting to sabotage federal law. On the other hand, the spending bill would continue to give hundreds of millions of tax dollars to abortion promoter and Democratic Party's stalwart Planned Parenthood, whose director spoke at the Democratic convention. The Republican Party, of course, promised to defund Planned Parenthood not so long ago. Meanwhile, the priorities of this Congress seem to be set by the Democratic Party rather than by the parties supposedly in charge. Democrats have defined the terms of the immigration debate from day one and still are. Now they're doing the same on gun control. So how should Republican voters feel about all of this? Britt Hume has watched a lot of Congresses come and go. That's why he's our senior political analyst at Fox, and he joins us now. Britt, is there a concern that Republican voters will look at this and be disappointed, or will they be so afraid of Democrats that they'll be motivated to vote anyway?
Well, Tucker, I'm not sure that's quite the choice. I'm sure Republican voters will be disappointed with this, but this is a very familiar pattern we're seeing here, and it comes down to this. It's a question of narrow majorities. In the United States Senate today, the Republican Party has the narrowest of majorities, And on most legislative measures, it takes 60 votes. That means you need Democrats. And
right.
Democrats, when it comes to a big measure like this, are going to stand by their sacred cows. They're going to stand by Planned Parenthood. They're going to try their best to get the DACA measure renewed. They're not going to get that, by the way, in this bill, but the president's not going to get his border wall funding either. So there you go. This is what happens with narrow majorities. If the Republicans had healthy majorities in both houses, they would be able to pass a bill that would contain all the priorities you cited and others as well, and the Democrats couldn't do a darn thing about it. Under these circumstances, however, they can't do that. It's just they don't have the votes.
Right. No, it's clear.
And when they try to...
It's clear they can't.
Sorry.
I just wonder, though, going into it, if maybe there wasn't overpromising. If people's expectations aren't met, it's just, you know, if someone promises you a pony for Christmas and you get a bag of hair, you never get over it. And so why would they promise things that they couldn't deliver?
Well, it wasn't. Well, of course, in the course of an election campaign, you don't know how the election is going to turn out. You don't know whether you're going to end up with a small majority or a large majority or no majority at all. So you come out and you say, this is what I'm for. This is what I'm going to be trying to do. Now, of course, that always gets translated to this is what I will do. Believe me, Tucker, there are Democratic representatives and senators all over this country who went out and promised all kinds of things that they're not going to get either. That's how it is when government is divided like this, very narrowly, and it's not a pretty sight. I mean, it used to be back in the day, and it's been a long time actually since I've actually seen it work this way, when there'd be a series of funding bills that would be debated and voted on, and then then the two houses would get together and they'd try to resolve the differences, and there was a lot of bipartisan sentiment, and everybody would give a little to get a little, and you'd get but in this bitterly divided political atmosphere, the Congress is a reflection of the country. We have a very, very deeply divided nation, and the kind of gridlock you're seeing that leads to this kind of extravaganza, $1.3 trillion, is a result of that.
No, that's right. A lot of people don't believe in the system, too. So really quickly, you said that Democrats stand by their sacred cows, the things on which they will not move. What are those for Republicans? Right. What are the things they won't compromise on?
Well, here's one thing the Republicans are certainly going to get in this bill is a significant increase in defense spending, which they wanted for a long time. They had to swallow some. They've had to swallow some increases in domestic spending they might not have wanted, but they're going to get that. And obviously, you know, they got their tax bill passed, and this bill will leave that undisturbed. They're not going to be able. And as of now, of course, Tucker, one of the great priorities that has defined the Republican Party going back a number of cycles has been the desire to get into the entitlement spending and reduce that, because that is the big driver of these staggering deficits and this massive national debt that we now face. But we have a president now who's not for that. And without that, obviously, you have no momentum behind that. So that's fallen by the wayside. But look, there are plenty of Republican priorities in this bill, no doubt about it. But I mean, I can't enumerate them all. But it's a long bill. There are anything this big, they're bound to be. And of course, remember this about this bill, Tucker. This is subject to the same thing big bills always are. Big bills that have to pass, that is to say, a bill that would keep the government open. People are going to try to attach whatever they've got to that bill to try to get, because they know it's going to get passed and signed into law. That's right. And so you get all kinds of ugly-looking ornaments hanging onto these things. Most of them get stripped out, but some of them get through. And when this bill is passed, we're going to find out more over a period of time of what's in it, and a lot of it nobody's going to like.
Some ugly ornaments. Well, we'll tell you what they are. Britt, thank you for that.
Okay, Tucker.
Congressman Steve King is in the Congress right now. He's a Republican, of course, from the state of Iowa, and he joins us tonight. Congressman, I thought Britt wisely said the two things that Republicans care about are tax cuts and military spending. Those are the two things they cared about in, I don't know, 1986. Those are longstanding priorities. This election set a new agenda, I would say. Voters said we want something a little different, and they're not getting any of that. The voters aren't getting any of the things that they thought they were going to get in 2016. Why is that?
Well, we don't think they're going to get them, and I'm disappointed by it, too. It's hard for me to imagine how we listen to a president campaign for all of those months and lay out a clear message, build the wall, end sanctuary cities, enforce immigration law, tighten up and restore the respect for the rule of law, end DACA, and it looks like none of that is going to be served up to us in this omnibus bill that's coming up.
Whose fault is that?
Well, part of it is, of course, the Democrats that have fought this, and that's just a given. But the other part is there's an element element of the anti-Trumpers that wanted to deny President Trump the results, the fruits of his electoral victory. And we've got some people that are more establishment than they are conservatives, and they really didn't want to say no to illegal immigrants in America. I hear it inside our conference. They will argue for them and say they came here due to no fault of their own, and we need to give them a pass and a path to citizenship, and that destroys the rule of law. And for me, it's always been about restoring the rule of law, not destroying the rule of law.
So Planned Parenthood does, I think, about 0 mammograms.
0 is exactly the
number. They provide more abortions than anybody in America, and they're campaigning for Democrats. Why should taxpayers give them $500 million a year, and why do no Republicans ever push back against that?
Tucker, it's completely and utterly foolish for Republicans to continue to fund Planned Parenthood, just to push back from the Democrats. And by the way, several months ago, when this issue was before us, I had a Democrat, he happens to be a member of the Congressional Black Caucus and a pastor, and I told him that I wanted to defund Planned Parenthood, and I would draw the line. If it shut the government down, it shuts the government down. He said he's willing to shut the government down if we don't fund Planned Parenthood, and he's a pastor.
But, well, that's obviously, I think, grotesque. But leaving aside even the central question of abortion, if the Democratic Party gets to take $500 million in taxpayer funds to pay for its adjunct Planned Parenthood, are Republicans pushing for $500 million for NRA? Or for national right to work? I mean, like, how does that work? Why do taxpayers get to fund their campaign arm?
I think that there's a certain element that's afraid of Planned Parenthood's lobbying capacity. Of course, the more funds we put in there, the stronger that they can lobby. But you're right on this. About 350,000 abortions a year are Planned Parenthood. They do 0 mammograms, and they're drawing down $500 million a year. And I think it was Senator Joni Ernst that said at one point, if we can't defund Planned Parenthood, shame on us. And that's I would be willing to shut the government down to defund Planned Parenthood. I can't do that alone. If there's a strong coalition, I would say no funding. Let's find out. Let's find out what the American people want. If they are determined that we should borrow money from China in order to fund abortions in America, then let's find out. This is a place to draw the line.
Well, at least let's have the conversation.
Yeah.
No one ever says it. But you do. Congressman King, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me here, Tucker. Appreciate it.
We've got a breaking news alert for you. It looks like a 6th bomb blast may have just hit Austin, Texas. The Austin Fire and Police Departments are responding to another reported package explosion. Right now, 1 injury is being reported. A building is being evacuated. The overall severity of that blast is not known. Obviously, we're following this as closely as we can. We'll bring you details as we get them. 50 years ago, college students campaigned for free speech. Now they say something called diversity is more important than the First Amendment. What does that mean, and where's it going? And that's what sets us apart from other countries, even relatively free countries, certainly the rest of Europe and Canada. But college students aren't interested at all. They may not even know it exists. A new survey by Gallup finds that 53% of college students say that having a diverse and inclusive society is more important than protecting free speech. Ann Coulter is an author and columnist and a hawk on free speech. She joins us tonight. It protects her and me and the rest of us. So, Ann, is it really an either-or? You can't have a diverse and inclusive country and keep the First Amendment?
Well, yes, of course you can. We've had it for a few hundred years.
Yeah.
What was strange about the survey, which I noticed immediately when it landed in my inbox, and it was odd that the New York Times presented it as if, well, we've covered all the bases here, is that the only breakdown, they did age breakdowns, gender breakdowns, political party breakdowns, the only ethnic breakdown was black and white Americans. Do they think we're living in the 1950s? Because what is striking is this is, of course, another problem of immigration. Our 2 main immigrant groups, Hispanics and Asians, overwhelmingly, whether it's the Pew Research Center, Cato, all kinds of surveys done over the years show that white and black Americans overwhelmingly support both free speech and gun rights, and you have almost the reverse percentages with recent immigrants. I mean, this idea that people come to our country and suddenly think, oh, I understand. Yes, you have a right to speak, even if I disagree with you, and even if you're insulting the Prophet Muhammad. No, it doesn't work that way. So what you're seeing at places like Berkeley, white students are only 30% of the population at Berkeley. Asian students alone are 46%. That's more than black and white Americans combined. That's why you're getting the biggest attacks on free speech at places like Berkeley.
Well, so that's fascinating
to watch.
So it's not a left-right thing as much as it's a new arrival versus born here thing. So then why wouldn't we be doing everything we can to inculcate our beliefs and understanding of our rights under our Constitution in people who just got here?
Yes, no, you're right. Well, because we have even among 11th generation Americans, these people called liberals, and they're as opposed to our fundamental freedoms as the newcomers are. But I mean, the ACLU has been surprisingly staunch on the issue of free speech, losing a lot of their donors, I might add, in the face of these recent attacks. But you would think that the ACLU would have an opinion on the importation of people adamantly opposed to the mission statement in their charter. I mean, we are looking at the death of America's fundamental freedoms, as you said in your introduction. Even England doesn't have free speech. Well, that's going to be it for America, both First Amendment and the Second Amendment, as this new generation of non-Americans grows up.
So why are our corporations abetting this, making it worse? Kroger, the grocery chain, announced today that it will no longer stock magazines with photographs of assault weapons. Not even clear how they're defining that or what an assault weapon is. But scary-looking guns are no longer allowed in photographs in Kroger. Since when are companies sort of piling on speech restrictions here?
Well, it's been at least since Trump has come along, maybe before then. But I return to my refrain. I don't care what your opinion is on free speech or guns or anything else, but please stop pretending you're a rebel. Please stop pretending you're fighting the man when you are just lockstep with corporate America. These new radicals we have, the resistance, they'll check with corporate America, Apple and Twitter, Facebook, and their professors to ask if they can wear a Question Authority T-shirt. Would that be okay?
Has there ever been a more obedient little cadre of robots than college students? Does anybody think, is anyone brave? Is anybody giving the finger to the man and speaking the truth? Where are those people? What happened?
Well, the good news is I'm following a lot of them on Twitter. I get the impression that we are creating, and the left is creating, without realizing it, this really hilarious and ferocious generation of right-wingers. These college students, they're listening to white privilege all day, every moment of every day. White heterosexual men are emerging from college barking at the moon, right-wingers. And they're a lot of fun to follow on Twitter. They're very funny.
I can't imagine why. Maybe there are unintended consequences to everything, apparently, and culture. Thank you.
Thank you.
Massive marches against gun rights are planned for this weekend. Why isn't anybody marching against the blunders by the state, by the authorities that enabled the massacre we're commemorating? New developments, by the way, on that story next. Descending on Washington, D.C., they'll be demanding that government restrict our right to bear arms. What they probably won't be marching for is better law enforcement. Maybe they should, because Nicholas Cruz was only able to carry out that massacre because both police ignored warnings about his behavior and then cowered in fear during the shooting itself. Meanwhile, at Great Mills High School in Maryland today, a potential mass shooting was halted when an armed school resource officer confronted a gunman who had shot 2 students. Only the gunman was killed. Jason Nicholas is a University of Maryland professor, and he joins us tonight. Professor, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
So, look, I understand people have different opinions about the Second Amendment, how far its protections extend, what gun control laws work or what don't. But you can't look at the massacre that will be commemorated this weekend and come away not concluding, if you're honest, that the problem was the laws in place were not enforced, that someone who was clearly a threat and known to be a threat was ignored, was allowed to buy a gun, and that the police on the scene, 4 of them, did nothing to stop the massacre. That's all factual, and it's being ignored in favor of attacking the NRA. Why is that?
So I think there are a couple of things. Number one, I'll tell you just personally, I'm pro-responsible gun ownership and pro-gun control. And I think one of the things that's a problem is we frame this argument as if, those two things can't coexist. I think as far as Nicholas Cruz, I think that some of the things you were saying are correct. But when we talk about the Great Mills situation, it's someone who, by all accounts, was a good kid, had no problems, respectful, an honor student, but had access to a gun.
But wait
and
a
that's
second.
and that's becomes the big problem.
There are, of course, millions of students who meet that description of access to guns who don't hurt anybody. In the case of Nicholas Cruz...
Well, I don't think should millions of young children...
Well, they have access in that there are millions of American homes where people safely keep firearms.
Yeah, well, if they
for
safely
protection.
keep them,
no, but look, there are lots of kids...
have access.
No, I mean, kids hunt, actually, in rural America. Lots of them. And in some places, they bring their rifles to school during deer season. They don't hurt anybody. This has been going on for generations, okay? That's the truth of it.
Okay.
So the point is, here you have someone with demonstrable mental illness who should not legally have been allowed to buy a gun, but was because the authorities ignored it. So if you really care about stopping school shootings, why are we ignoring that? I don't know. I'm really honestly confused.
I understand what you're saying. I also believe that one of the issues is the fact that he was, I believe, 19 years old and was able to buy a pistol. Now, I think that that's a problem.
Okay,
because
but again, he wasn't legally allowed to buy any gun because he was mentally ill and known to be mentally ill. He was the subject of scores of police complaints.
We're not going to disagree here on Nicholas Cruz.
But hold on. This is an actual massacre in which 17 people died.
Absolutely.
Nobody on the left is saying word one about it. They're in effect protecting the people who failed by not calling them out on their failures in favor of making statements about the NRA, which was not involved in any way in this massacre. So I'm questioning the good faith here.
I think what they're trying to do is cover all bases. I've heard people say that there was wrong on the part of law enforcement, that people should have picked this up earlier with Nicholas Cruz. But like I said, with young Rollins today, he was not somebody that the FBI or law enforcement could have picked up on.
We don't know that, actually. We didn't know much about Nicholas Cruz because the authorities hid their own failures for the first week.
What his neighbors have said.
But we don't know. It just happened. I'm just saying, this guy killed 17 people. So, look, here, very quickly, this is the question I want to ask the organizers of the march, but they're too cowardly to come on and explain. But it's a simple question. What specific law are we calling for here?
I think that there are many things that they're calling for. They're calling for an end to bump stocks. They're calling for a raise in the age limit. We have a kid who's 18 or 19. They're
calling for an end to bump stocks. So they're celebrating.
Whoa, hold on. I haven't finished.
Okay.
I haven't finished. We have kids that we say are not mature enough or emotionally intelligent enough to take a drink of alcohol, but we're willing to give them a deadly weapon.
Okay, now let me ask you, do you really believe that if we're to ban bump stocks, and the president, I think, is doing it unilaterally anyway, and raise the age for firearm purchases to 21, you think we'd end school shootings?
I think we would limit some of those school shootings.
You do think that?
I do believe so.
Is there evidence of that? Is that a guess?
Well, I think, when we look at Nicholas Cruz...
Well, he was already not allowed to buy a gun, but the authorities, because they didn't want to add to the sum total of school discipline cases, didn't say anything about it.
If he were 21, he probably would not have been able to get into that school. I think that he
wasn't allowed to buy a gun in the first place under existing law, but the people in charge didn't feel like enforcing it.
Again, we're not disagreeing.
Right, so it wouldn't have stopped that because that would have been stopped by another law that we passed.
If you get rid of, since you wanted to bring up bump stocks, if you get rid of bump stocks, a lot of people in Las Vegas, since, we're talking about gun violence generally, a lot of people would have still been alive and maybe things could have happened differently.
A bump stock makes it almost impossible to hit anything, and I'm not sure that we know what percentage of people were killed. He didn't exclusively fire with a bump stock, and anyone who knows anything about guns, it's a ridiculous device that makes the gun impossible to control. I'm just saying, nobody cares about bump stocks.
He wasn't sniping people. Right. He was going and shooting en masse.
I'm just worried we're not really addressing the real issues here. If we're talking about, you know what I mean?
No,
bump stocks.
I think that there are some issues that you are correct that we need to do a better job of enforcement. But when we also look at gun violence generally, we can look at somewhere like Alaska, for example, which has the highest rate of gun violence, gun deaths per capita.
Yeah.
And you don't need a permit to buy a weapon.
No, it has
you
nothing
don't
to do
need
with
a
that.
permit
Alaska
to carry a weapon.
No, it's not. It's your stats are totally wrong. It's suicide that's Alaska's problem. It has to do
And
with
that's
a lot of
that's
cultural
an issue
problems,
as well.
Nothing to do with guns. Anyway,
and then Louisiana, Mississippi, but okay.
Great to see you, Professor. Thank you.
Absolutely, always fun.
Nicholas Cruz is not the only failure of the FBI recently. Here's a shocking one. In 2015, the Bureau directly encouraged an attempted massacre at that Muhammad cartoon contest in Texas. That happened. Now they're getting sued for it. We'll give you the details in a minute. Plus, there's been another explosion in Austin. At least one person injured en route to the hospital at this hour. Reports of another suspicious, at least one person reportedly is hurt. We'll supply further details, obviously, the second they come in. Austin police have shut down a city street in another part of town over a suspicious package. Apparently, it's in an apartment building. What do we know about the explosives that have been used in this bomb? How were they made? What do they look like? Johnny Joey Jones is an explosives expert. He was wounded in Afghanistan. He joins us tonight. Johnny, thanks for coming on. So from what we know publicly about these bombs, what does it add up to from what you can tell?
Well, it's really hard right now. I think that the candor the police are showing in appealing to the bomber and asking the public for information is very genuine and very telling. I stay very connected to the bomb tech community, and I can tell you now there's not a lot of information out there, so the police are keeping whatever they have pretty tight-lipped. Take the one tripwire or clothesline or whatever you call it aside, everything else is consistent in the sense that it's put into a package and either placed or shipped now. And so that's the one consistent thing other than the area that we have to go on. There isn't enough information on the type of explosive or how they're wired up and set off for us to make any kind of assumption or presumption on where they're coming from. In other words,
no, that's right.
I can see certain circuits and say, okay, Inspire magazine, you know, Iraq, Afghanistan, Taliban, ISIS, or I can see pipe bomb and think, okay, domestic, homegrown. Right now, we're not getting enough of that information to know.
So we have heard the bombs described as increasingly sophisticated, and that was particularly applied to the bomb detonated with a tripwire. Without giving anything away, but give us some perspective, is that a sophisticated device, a bomb that's ignited with a tripwire?
No, that's actually really simple. And I can tell you that if you can think of a clothesline with your positive or your clothespin with your positive and negative on the top and bottom and put a piece of rubber or wood in between it, and then run a wire from that piece of rubber or wood, you trip over that and then that spring pulls it down. It's really, really simple. But the point being, what we're seeing today with someone shipping a package, that takes away a lot of those presumptions I had 24 hours ago. Everything I've heard up until last night seemed like pretty simple mechanical engineering. You can use a washing machine timer to create standoffs so you can get away. Really simple and what we would call surefire techniques. But to put something in the mail, to have it thrown around, put in a truck, thrown on a conveyor belt before it goes off, that suggests something much more sophisticated and, quite honestly, much scarier.
Interesting. Does it also suggest a different kind of explosives?
No, it doesn't necessarily mean anything for the... So there's two types of science, right? There's the chemistry in the explosive.
Right.
That can be binary, like aluminum powder and another ingredient I won't say, but you can get it in tannerite. Or it can be very chemistry intensive, like TATP and other types of explosives. And so that's one part of the science. And then the other part is electric circuitry or mechanical circuitry. And those two are very different but can seem the same way. For example, the first bomb, they said that when the lady opened it, it exploded. That could be something really simple, like two wires in a hook pattern that just come together when you open it. Or it can be something really complex, like a photocell that allows the current to go through when light hits it. So there's a rudimentary way for those bombs. With something put into the mail and shipped around, you kind of have to believe it's a little bit more sophisticated than that, and that's concerning. But it doesn't say much to the chemistry of the explosive at all.
So if you were to see the explosive device, would signatures be obvious to you? In other words, do certain groups build certain kinds of bombs? Is that correct?
To an extent. I mean, we saw very different bombs in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you think about it, in Iraq, there's a certain amount of infrastructure, and they can do things that are a little trickier. Use cell phones, use IR sensors, but it's like the game Mousetrap. The more you add to it, the more will go wrong. So when we moved over to Afghanistan in 2009, where I worked dozens, if not hundreds of IEDs, Over there, it's real simple. It's like your loop circuit on your flashlight, except instead of a bulb, you've got a bomb. It's a little bit easier to defeat once you find it, but it's also a lot more reliable. And so those are the two types of bombs we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. Bring it home, a lot of what we see here are pipe bombs, which actually have a powder train time fuse, which means you light it and it burns until it blows up, like Wile E. Coyote. What we're seeing here today are electronically initiated, which is a lot harder to accomplish. And there's one specific part and piece I won't talk about too much that's really hard to make at home or hard to get a hold of. Everything else, very common.
So those are obviously two completely different categories. So that will tell us a lot.
Yes, exactly.
Johnny, thank you for that. That was really interesting. We appreciate it. When we come back, we'll have the latest on what, as we said, appears to be the 6th bomb attack in Austin, Texas. Just with the latest. Casey?
Yeah, Tucker, unbelievable. We got off the air with you at the top of the hour, and now here we are in a different spot because a 6th bomb has gone off in Austin, and it is in South Austin this time. We are at the intersection of Brody Lane and Slaughter Lane, and this is actually pretty close to the bomb site on Sunday. We're only about 6 miles away, the one that had the tripwire on it. So you see a real heavy police activity in the area right now. We've got us pushed back pretty far because clearly it's a fluid and dangerous situation. They want to keep everyone, including the public who's gathering, to take pictures and see all of this for themselves. They want to keep them safe. We know that it was at a Goodwill. Whether it was inside, outside, that is unclear at this point, but we know it was a Goodwill because when the dispatch call went out, we matched the address, and my producer was able to contact Goodwill locally, and the woman was very upset on the phone, saying that it was one of their workers. So one person injured. It is not life-threatening. So that is the latest here as police are now dealing with a 6th bombing tonight in Texas's capital city, Tucker.
Shocking. Casey, thanks for that. I appreciate it. Well, that's about it for us tonight. It's been a terrifying night in Austin, Texas. During this very broadcast, 5 bomb attacks grew to 6. Every hour could bring another bomb blast and more victims. Police have recovered an intact explosive and are working with more than 300 federal agents to crack the case. Obviously, we'll relentlessly cover every development in this breaking story. Good night from Washington. Breaking news continues next on Hannity.
All right, thanks, Tucker. And this is a Fox News alert. Austin on edge again this hour. We start with breaking news tonight. By the way, my monologue will be coming up later in the show. Austin, Texas on high alert yet again after police are responding to what is now a 6th explosion that has left one person injured again. Now, this explosion comes after authorities earlier this evening confirmed that 2 package bombs today at FedEx facilities in Austin and near San Antonio are linked to 4 other attacks that have taken place this month. Now, these attacks have prompted a massive federal and state manhunt to find who authorities are describing as a serial bomber. Joining us on the ground in Austin, Texas tonight, Fox News correspondent at large, our friend Geraldo. Geraldo, literally this just happening minutes ago. All right, apparently we're going to get back to Geraldo. By the way, that is a live shot in Austin, Texas. By the way, what we learned earlier today is 2 packages located at 2 separate FedEx facilities in Austin, San Antonio. Yes, in fact, they were connected to the 4 previous package explosions that occurred that we have been following. And we go now to Geraldo Rivera. As you can see, he's on the scene. Geraldo.
He's on the scene. Geraldo, you're up now. Can you hear it?
Sean, I got you. It has happened again. Just as the authorities thought they were closing in on the Austin serial bomber with the possibility of having surveillance video from the FedEx and, having the package that did not explode, all leading toward they thought maybe they could identify a perpetrator, could possibly identify a perpetrator. Then suddenly at about 8 o'clock New York time, this happened, another explosion. We think it's a Goodwill. Imagine how diabolical you can be to send a bomb in a package to a Goodwill. It's exploded. At least one person we know of has been injured. Sean, it is, the Texas Capitol has been absolutely in a panic since the 2nd day of March when the first of this series of explosions happened. Now, despite the best efforts of hundreds, indeed thousands of federal, state, and local authorities, The bomber has managed to perpetrate yet another attack. But Sean, can you imagine doing it at a Goodwill? How dirty, low can you get? They thought they were closing in on him, and he does this to us, Sean.
It is unbelievable. I see all the action going on there behind you. This has been brazen in as much as it is one town. It is one city. What are law enforcement gleaning from that, Geraldo? Because, you know, obviously everyone would be afraid if, in fact, it was moving outside the area. But the people of Austin are terrified for